Hey, everybody. Welcome to Daniel Davis Deep Dive. We've got a good show for you today. It's a little bit different than what we've been doing here of late, which is basically covering the current actions that are going on, and whether it's the war in Ukraine and Russia or the one going on down in Israel and between Hamas, or God forbid that we're going to be doing one in China and Taiwan here later. Hope that never happens. We'll just talk about the conditions that go underneath that. But today I want to talk about something that you also need to know about that's rarely in the news. Now, one of the big benefits of Deep Dive is that we take the issues in the military and foreign policy areas that are, trending in the news. We give you a deeper understanding one. This one's going to be a little bit deeper than that even, or more useful to you, because this is not even hardly in the news, but it has significant ramifications for how we conduct our foreign policy, how we conduct our military, because so many people just assume that, like what President Biden said on 60 Minutes a couple of weeks ago, that, we're the strongest country in the history of the world, meaning we can do anything we want to do. And as I told you when that came out, that's not entirely accurate. And there are some significant limitations that we need to be able to figure out. And this is going to be going down that path. Now, there was an article today in the Business Insider that's asking a question of, are we doing our military modernization correctly? And, Gary, if you can bring that magazine cover up there so they can see what I'm talking about. Yeah, that's the one there. So it says, the Army needs tanks to win a war in the Pacific, but it wants to know if we're doing the right job. And the gist of the article was that they were getting into, are we doing modernization correctly? And there's, a number of things that the Army in particular has going on at the time. And I thought this was a really good opportunity to talk about Army modernization and where we've been over the last nearly quarter century in trying to upgrade and update our Army. Now, I think, as I've told many before, I was in Desert Storm in the 1991, where we had this massive army, an allied army of 500,000 people, and we just rolled across part of Saudi Arabia and up into northern Kuwait to get rid of the Iraqi Republican Guard army that had invaded Kuwait about 5-6 months before that. And it was just, a devastating, just tremendous victory, just absolutely eviscerated the entire Iraqi army, which was the 5th largest in the world at the time. But everyone understood that, okay, now things have to change because, the Soviet Union had fallen apart, but in time, even at that time, we said, the Russian forces will recover and that they'll rebuild, and that we knew the Chinese were in the process of building. So we had this great window of time where we said, okay, there's really no peer competitor out there right now. And our existing army has proven that there's unchallenged in the world. So we can now do a modernization program and make sure that when the rest of the world starts catching up, we're already ahead. Terrific attitude, great concept. It's exactly what we needed to do. We definitely had this strategic window of invulnerability with which to do it. I mean, you couldn't have written it up any better. And in 1999, so 8 years after Desert Storm, the Chief of Staff of the Army, a guy named General Eric Shinseki, went before the U.S. Congress to give a hearing to talk about the modernization progress and kind of lay out where we were going to go. And he said this.
The Secretary of the Army and I recently announced a new Army vision, and we did so after an intensive process that lasted over 3 months. We conducted assessment interviews with hundreds of stakeholders to determine what the Army's current needs are. Many told us we needed to move farther and faster to change, to embrace the information age, and to respond to an altered strategic environment. We formed 4 task forces to address those concerns and to plot a course for the Army's long-term future. Based upon that work, we developed a vision for transforming this most respected Army into a strategically responsive force that is dominant across the full spectrum of operations.
Now, that future that he was talking about there, he later gave, and I think even the same year at an Army event, he said was basically the future combat systems. And what that entailed was it was going to be a system of systems, is what he called it. There were, at that time, 18 systems that were networked together in a highly effective architecture with communications that would link the different platforms together. Some drones, but they used to call them aerial vehicles, unmanned aerial vehicles, robotic ground vehicles, different kinds of robotics, different classes even of unmanned aerial vehicles, and then a class of manned vehicles and wheeled vehicles and tracked vehicles that would then all work seamlessly together. And this, the some of its parts were better than any of the individuals, and it would be more powerful because it would have sensor to shooter links. It would allow you to shoot over line of sight, so you didn't even have to see what you were shooting at with your eyes. Again, concept was fantastic. Vehicles were lighter so that they could deploy more easily. They could be sustained greater in combat. I mean, honestly, the concept that General Shinseki came up with was really dynamite. If we had been able to execute it and turn it into reality, then we would have today the preeminent military force of the future, and we would already be 2 steps ahead of either Russia or China. Now, if you've been watching our channel much, you'll know that I argue that we're not, we don't have that overmatch. So the question is, what happened? How did we get there? Now, in 2004, the next step in this iteration is that let me paint the strategic picture at the time. This is when we had invaded Iraq in 2002, and it had already started to get bogged down into an insurgency, and we were already having to shift our gears and put more troops on the ground over there and focus on counterinsurgency instead of the large-scale maneuver operations that we had done in Desert Storm and had prepared for the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Union all these years during the Cold War. And the Vice Chief of Staff of the Army went before a AUSA, Association of the United States Army meeting in 2004, and he told the assembled audience this.
In the era of modularity, we are moving to a brigade-based army and moving away from a division-based army. This includes the new striker brigades like the 3rd Brigade, 2nd Infantry Division that just completed their great tour of duty in Iraq. They have proven themselves so well in combat under the great leadership of Colonel Mike Rounds. They effectively use speed and situational understanding during their deployment for great success. The speed and agility of the strikers has earned the 3rd of the 2nd a nickname among many Iraqis. Reportedly around Samarra, they're renowned as the Ghost Riders.
Now, let me correct something I just said. I said the 2002 invasion of Iraq. We prepared for it in 2002, but didn't execute it until March 2003. So what he was talking about there was some of the units that had operated in Iraq there, and they were noticed, called the Ghost Riders. So now then, the next question is what happens next? So we have just so you understand what he was talking about there and go into modularity. Now, up until that point, the Army had remained largely unchanged since Second World War. It was basically brigades, divisions, and corps. That's how we fought in Desert Storm. That's how we were arrayed as the 90s came to a close there. So he's saying that now then in the early part of the 2000s, based on all the things that he mentioned in there, in the current fight, that they're going to go to this modularity plan to where now it's not going to be division and corps centric, but it's going to be modular. So it's going to be what they call then not brigades, but BCTs, brigade combat teams. So they were modular. You could pick and choose. You could even get battalions. You can pick them up here and you can move 3 together here and maybe take 1 here and put 4 and have a package based on whatever was going on at the ground so that the pieces would be all together and then they could be fought together. Now, at the time that came out, I thought, terrific. They read the book because a friend of our show, Doug McGregor, in 1997, 2 years before Shinseki's vision, had talked about modularity. And he had talked about how to link things together. But he had some significant differences with how we were affecting it at the time, because Doug's vision is that a lot of these organizations would be able to operate in austere conditions so that if the network connections weren't right or if they were blocked by the enemy, the organization was self-contained and it could still fight and still use some of these shooter links by other means. Those were kind of left out of the issue with the 2004 version of modernization. So we went away from the old construct into this new one. Now, if we had stayed there and continued to do that, or if we'd used the breaking the phalanx kind of things, because again, you see, it's in a whole blueprint. If you ever want to read it, it's available on Amazon. It's a whole blueprint for how we could have gotten there, how we could have transformed the Army into a really amazing thing, along with all of the technology that would be needed, because you have to, I think he talks about it there as a rapid iteration. to where you try new technologies. If it doesn't work, you put that aside, you try something next, you see what did work, and you iterate with that, and then you go a little bit further. Meanwhile, you take technology that it already is mature, you start making pieces of that so that you can actually fight now. You don't have to wait until everything works together correctly. And then over time, you keep, pushing the envelope, get better and better and better, things that other people don't even have, while you have things that work right now. You choose the legacy equipment. You also use new technology that was available. And again, it just is a great idea and could have been spectacularly done. Unfortunately, we didn't go down that path. So what the Army did is they started a formal Future Combat Systems program, the FCS, which in 2008, I joined at Fort Bliss, Texas, and I was an operations officer there. So I was part of all the testing and the planning. And so I saw it all from the inside. So I knew exactly what we were doing. And I was excited about it because I had read Doug's book and I knew for sure we needed to modernize. So I'm like, this is going to be great. I can't wait to get there and be a part of something that's basically making the future. If only it had worked out that way. So what I'm going to show you next is basically a marketing video that the Army put together in 2008, the same year that I started in the program. What it's designed to do, and I'm just going to show you a little snippet of it, is they dramatized what they projected the future war would be like by grafting on some CGI and some other kind of things, along with some actual footage, and basically made it almost like a small movie to show what was possible. And well, you can see it for yourself here, and I'll talk about it on the back.
Normandy secure. Normandy is secure.
Rick, check your red picture. 3 columns, 150 plus. They want that command node back.
Enemy dismount, 200 meters.
Displace the Overlord. Time now.
Outside right. Damn it. Negative. I got injured civilians on the objective. Need priority effects at our current position.
Sergeant, don't you think? We're gonna need more guys.
No, Garrett. Not today.
FCS One Team partners are working now to develop the technologies to help soldiers today. Air and ground robotics, recon and surveillance, survivability, communications, all made possible with an unprecedented network. FCS is an investment in the future that will pay dividends to our soldiers today.
That is the commitment of FCS, to secure the present and ensure the future.
Man, if only that was true. If we had been able to do a fraction of that, we would have an amazing military today. Just so you know, we spent over $20 billion and wasted almost a decade of time, and then the program was canceled. Now, let's see, while I was still in the program in January of 2009, I published an article called Heavy and Agile, 9 steps to a more effective force. So I recognized right away when I came into the program, because I'd had actual combat experience, I knew some of the things that they were claiming that we could do were just not going to work in real life, at least not the way that they were projecting them to be. And I tried within the program to tell people about it, tell some of the leaders, but of course I was only a major at the time. So, colonels and generals aren't going to listen to somebody of my low rank, especially if I'm saying something they don't want to hear. So they just kind of ignored that. Well, I knew that if this program went forward as it was, that it was going to set us up for failure and possibly a loss on a future battlefield. And the reason I knew that is because I had many colleagues in various other portions of this future combat system, because it was divided into things like armor, some of the infantry fighting things, the unmanned aerial vehicle section, the communication section, technology, so all different kinds of pieces that went into making this up. And I was talking to these people, and I went to some of the technology demonstration exercises where these things were supposed to be showed how they were developing. And I knew that it was just hogwash. These people knew, for example, I'll never forget one of the communications officers, another major who also had combat experience, was telling me that all these things that are absolutely essential for this whole process to work, the system of systems, was the network. If the network didn't work, then instead of having this interconnected world where vehicles could be spread out and bring all of their effects to bear at one time, would instead be a point of vulnerability because they wouldn't be able to communicate in certain areas, in certain ways, and it would be able to be intercepted and blocked by enemy electronic warfare systems. And that's how it was playing out. So in all these exercises they were doing, even the nominal efforts that they were making to try and replicate an enemy EW situation capability was succeeding. It was blocking it. So if it was on the side of a mountain, if there's terrain in between, this is at Fort Bliss, Texas, by the way, which is basically open desert. But when they did some of these things in the least amount of terrain, the signals were blocked and they weren't communicating. Problem is, they actually told Congress and the American people it was working brilliantly. Every time they went before Congress, they would say, this was working, that's working. And I knew for a fact that it wasn't working. And unfortunately, that finally came to a head so I wrote this article in January of 2009, and I pointed out a lot of the mistakes and a lot of the errors. And before I published this, I went to our commanding officer and I said, hey, this is coming out. I want to make sure you're clear before it ever comes out that, if you have any issues with it, I can address those before I publish it. They all said, no, it's fine. I think that their view was no one's going to listen to you anyway. It's just the Armed Forces Journal. It's not like the New York Times or something. So they didn't pay any attention to that until it came out. And then apparently the generals in Washington paid a great deal of attention, and they were furious because they knew that for this thing to continue going on, they had to get funding every single year. So they had to get billions and billions. And if the Congress got wind of the fact that this wasn't working, that the things weren't panning out, and that it probably wouldn't succeed in the future, then the question, of course, the funding would come into question, and they would have to either change things or the program would be canceled. Well, they didn't like that. And so I won't go into the story today, but I was effectively silenced and put off on the shelf so that I was not around any of those things anymore. Problem is, for America, all the things that I identified were still very real and very problematic. Well, as it turned out, the Government Accountability Office, the GAO, was also available and tracking every single one of these roads. And they were putting out reports almost every year that came to the same conclusions I did, and in fact had more detail because they actually had access where the generals, they didn't have control over them. So they reported whatever they reported. Finally, that got around to the Secretary of Defense, Robert Gates. And later in 2009, not months after I wrote this article, the program was canceled. And it was canceled for about half of the reasons that I had mentioned is what he cited in there. And the thing was mothballed. Now, the problem, well, there's many problems, but one of them is that many of the people who were in charge of this disaster, this failure, this known failure that they tried to cover up and didn't tell anybody the truth, were promoted. Sounds familiar? And unfortunately, that's not new to anybody probably watching this or knows anything about the Army. They were moved up and they sent on to other organizations, and most of them failed there as well. But that's, again, deep dive for another day. Here's the problem. What Secretary Gates said at the time was, we're going to take all the good things that worked about the program, we're going to mold them into a new one, and then we're going to have a new modernization vehicle program. It's not so ambitious, something a little bit smaller. Again, makes sense because some of the technology was, working. They did put $20 billion into it. But the problem is they said, okay, this is going to be a 7-year process. And in 7 years, we'll have a working prototype. And they're starting from scratch, even though they said they were taking advantage of all the things that had been done since 1999. And now this is 2009, so a full decade, but they were still going to take another 7 years. Well, you're not going to be surprised to know that program was also canceled, never produced a single operational prototype. Then they came in with another ground vehicle program. That one was canceled, never produced a single ground prototype. And about I'm not sure, maybe about 3 or 4 months ago, the Army announces, you got it, a new ground vehicle modernization program and another 7-year process. So right now we're pushing out to almost 2030. And why would we think that they're going to do anything different than they've done before? So let me just point out what that means. The Bradleys, tanks, our artillery pieces, and some of the attack helicopters we have right now that have been the bulk of our force since Desert Storm in 1991, started coming into the force in the early 1980s. And those were legit good products that were built by combat veterans, most of whom served during World War II and the Vietnam War and the Korean War. So these guys knew what would, just like I knew what combat was going to work and what wouldn't, and they actually produced something good. And they were honest about things that didn't work. They got rid of some other stuff. They had some mistakes. If anybody knows anything about the Bradley development, there was a lot of waste with that, but it ended up working anyway. We have not done anything since the 1980s, folks. No new vehicles. We've added some new gadgets. We've done numerous upgrades on the M1 process, the M1 Abrams tank. I think they're up to version 3 now, the M3 A3, I think. And so we're making it better, but it's still the same basic tank from 1980. And if we don't get this fixed, folks, that business Insider article I showed you at the first, then we're going to be talking 7 years from now how that also didn't work. That's what they're asking here. Just the Army needs tanks to win, but who knows if the Abrams is the right tank job and what is? Well, right now, the people who have been in charge of the last 2 decades of failure are still in charge of it here. And so that doesn't give me a lot of expectation of success. And that's where we want to end it today. So that's kind of the national / strategic view of the history of where we got to get up to the start of this one here, Business Insider. Now, in the subsequent episodes, we're going to be talking about what have we seen in the current and then the projected future of warfare. How have things changed dramatically since the 2020 war between Armenia and Azerbaijan, where drones and missiles really came into the forefront on the operational level? Of course, the Ukraine-Russia war, where it's gone to an even newer level, and all kinds of new electronic warfare capabilities have come in. Anti-drone capabilities have come in on top of the new versions of drones, missiles, long-range missiles. All of that is dramatically changing the nature of warfare right now. The question is, how is the United States operating? Are we doing a good job with this? Are we projecting our future based on these emerging realities, so that in 7 years, when these things come off the drawing board, are we ahead of the curve, or are we still behind it when there's a new nature of war? So we're going to talk about a lot of those things. We'll look at specific elements of our future modernization: tanks and artillery pieces and infantry fighting vehicles, electronic warfare, drones, counter drones, engineering assets. Much bigger issue than many people thought, as we see with the Ukraine side trying to get through the Russian engineering minefields, and now the vice versa with Russia trying to go through the Ukraines. How are we set up for that? How are we set up for communications? That's one of the most crucial things on the battlefield. All these things are great, but if they can't communicate, you can't do anything on the battlefield. We're going to be talking about that and giving you a deep dive so you have a full understanding of exactly what's going on, and whether your country is doing something that it needs to be doing, or whether we need to be demanding some changes. Spoiler alert, we do. We need to be making some changes. But I'm going to equip you with the information that you need to be able to understand that, so that you can, if you want to, you can ping your congressman and tell them, hey, let's do something that's going to make some sense. So look, folks, ultimately, we're all in this together. That's the reason we made this channel for Deep Dive, so that you understand the reality of what's going on based on our observations and things that are not just the smooth talkers and the people who have financial benefit for things going in a certain way. We're going to tell you the truth, and we're going to keep doing that. So we appreciate you coming. Ask you to like and subscribe and pass on to everybody you know, so that they can also benefit from these this true things that we have here. Be sure and join us tomorrow. We have another Deep Dive Live at 11 a.m. Eastern Time with a friend of the show, Rajan Menon. So until then, we will see you next time on Deep Dive.